Thank you, Acting Speaker. I rise today to speak on the Justice legislation supporting victims and other matters Amendment Bill 2020. I want to acknowledge the member for Buninyong's powerful contribution. Fundamentally, when I've been reading through the materials provided to us as members, the thing that really speaks out loud and clear in this legislation is this is about giving power back to victim survivors. Really, this just sums up pretty much all of these amendments. It's important that when victim survivors whose control and power over their own lives have been taken away from them, often by abhorrent acts, that they know that our justice system and our legal system will back them up to make things easier for them and not more difficult. The incredible bravery that it takes to report and then follow through and go through the enormous legal process, which can be very, very formal and quite confusing, can really take away a lot of people's self-confidence. So being able to give power back to victims by allowing a more simplified and reasonable response to be able to self-identify that they were a victim and a survivor is something that is well worth our while to address in this parliament. These amendments are about listening to victims, listening to what they want and really supporting them. It is a response to victims and survivors of sexual assault who have raised concerns about how the law operates currently and how it can prevent them from sharing their stories. We know from having talked to victims and survivors that the empowerment by sharing their story in their own time and pace is really important for them and can really change their healing process after such a traumatic event. I want to thank the Attorney-General for her work on this amendment bill. This amendment is not just about giving back power to victim survivors. It supports and strengthens a whole range of other measures that needed to update our current legislation. For example, there's a range of measures in this amendment that supports workers who have been injured at work during this COVID-19 pandemic. Their circumstances are very different, and obviously we're in a very different scenario than if a worker had been injured at work prior to COVID. The Andrews Labor government always stands up for workers' rights and the workforce to make sure that they are not disadvantaged. This bill also seeks to modernise the area around defamation laws, which is well and truly needed. For far too long, wealthy and powerful individuals have sometimes used defamation laws to hide and intimidate their victims. Flimsy arguments around defamation have been used to prevent their victims from being able to speak about their experiences. This bill goes towards addressing that injustice. The bill also seeks to support victims through the role of Crime Consultative Committee, because this government is a government that listens. Those opposite went to the last state election on a crime platform, and in some degree Victorians listened because they were well and truly decided, but it was the Andrews Labor government that was best to trust and manage justice. Victorians rejected the dog whistling of race politics. Victorians overwhelmingly recognise that it is an Andrews Labor government that they can trust to ensure that our justice system performs better. This Andrews Labor government will always stand with victims of crime. We've seen that with supporting victims in historical sexual offences or victims of family violence. We've seen that with this government's response, and that we have a Minister for Prevention of Family Violence. We have responded so comprehensively to the recommendations set out in the Royal Commission towards family violence. And we have a Minister for Victim Support and recognise the importance to provide that support to Victorians. We've invested in services to support victims, and in the most recent budget committed $26.5 million towards victim support services. And since 2017, this government has invested over $48 million to support and to provide services for victims of crimes. This includes the Intermediaries Pilot Program. This program boosts frontline staff and increases the capacity of the Victims of Crime helpline. Intermediaries are skilled communication specialists who work with vulnerable witnesses. This could be at a police interview, a trial stage, and they empower witnesses to give good evidence. Previously, vulnerable witnesses and victims, child witnesses and those who perhaps have a cognitive impairment really haven't been given access to justice without an intermediary. So this program really helps them navigate the criminal justice system, which can be so confusing and intimidating. The budget also provided $6.9 million over 4 years for the Child Witness Service. Once again, this is specialist support to child witnesses and their families, and really helps them navigate and prepare for that criminal trial process and debriefing and helping out post-trial as well. Victims of Crime Helpline was provided from the budget $7.2 million over 2 years to support victims and helping provide additional capacity. During lockdown, this important service has continued to operate uninterrupted and continued helping those victims of crimes with that essential support. We've also seen the Family Violence Restorative Justice Service established, and this was a recommendation from the Royal Commission into Family Violence. Once again, this government is about supporting victims and help them talk about their harms that they're experienced and heal from that trauma of family violence. It's an important part of victim survivors' recovery. Once again, these are all part of the reasons why Victorians choose to trust the Andrews Labor government when it comes to justice. We've also seen some important reforms to protect victims' rights. In 2016, the Criminal Procedure Act 2009 was amended, and this allowed recorded evidence of sexual assault victims from the Children's Court to be used in appeals in high courts and other related criminal or civil proceedings. We've created a presumption against parole when a person is convicted of taking another person's life and does not assist in locating the body. This amendment is something that the community has really supported and expected from their government. We've provided victims an independent advocate with the role of Victims of Crimes Commissioner and really strengthened the support structures for victims of crimes. The bill has come about from listening to victims and survivors of sexual assault who have told the government about how the law has impacted them and how it is currently impacting their ability to share their story. I would like to pay tribute to all those victim survivors who have had the courage to speak publicly about the trauma and the violence that they've experienced. Sharing their stories is not a source of shame, it's a sign of strength. It's only right and just that this government continues to support them. I'm reminded of a constituent that shared with me her experience from many, many years ago. The shame that she carried, although no fault was hers. The courage she took. And the healing started to begin with being able to share her story with me. This was a brave woman who has carried her story for over 70 years. We were able to connect her up with support agencies. This legislation allows her to be in control of her story and to stop the suffering that she has had over that 70 years. The bill amends the Act to allow victim survivors of sexual offence to be publicly identified if they give the written consent and without the need to go about hiring a lawyer and going to the courts to seek permission and navigate once again that difficult process. This amendment really makes clear that victim survivors can self-identify, for example, online, which obviously is keeping our legislation up to date and current with how society operates in 2020. The bill also allows child victim survivors to be identified provided they've been given independent third-party support, such as from a doctor or a psychologist who is really trained in this area to certify that they understand the consequences of their decision and that they are happy for their story to be shared. It ensures that they have the capacity to consent. The bill allows for deceased victim survivors and those who lack decision-making capacity to be identified by the media with the court's permission. The Victorian Law Reform Commission's Contempt of Court report really makes clear that currently the law is complex, confusing and needed to be modernised. And Acting Speaker, this is what this amendment seeks to do. Previously, since 1991, it's been an offence to publish details that could identify an alleged victim of sexual assault, and the offence was intended to safeguard and protect the privacy of victim survivors, and really to prevent that fear of public identification from occurring. The Act allowed publication with specific circumstances, and it was intended to give pathways for the survivors to publish their identifying details. But we now know that this is part of law is too complex. And we know that from hearing from victims and survivors that it was too complicated and too intimidating to go through. The long process to be able to tell their stories. Ownership of their story and how they choose to tell it must be in the hands of the victims and survivors. We've also seen a change in how society views sexual offending. You know, unfortunately, our society perhaps wasn't as supportive to survivors of sexual offences in earlier years, and thankfully we've really changed as a society on how we view victim survivors. It is, of course, appropriate for the courts to continue a role in granting permission for publishing details where a victim survivor does not have the capacity to provide those details. I support this legislation and I hope that victim survivors are empowered by this change and by knowing that their government has listened to them, and I commend this bill to the House.